Quick has a fantastic global footprint, and we haven't mentioned it yet, but of course, you're part of the Kuehne organization, which is, a much larger entity, arguably the largest freight forwarder on the planet with, 80 plus thousand employees and I think 1,300 sites last time I checked. What's the decision-making process around outsourcing? Because I mean, even though you've got such a tremendous global footprint, and even though I'm sure you leverage your parent company's capabilities where possible or where needed, what are the decision-making process? What's the decision-making process around the outsourcing? And when you outsource, is there a lack of digital integration when you're working with those outsource partners?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because it's a challenge. Obviously, if you just isolate the United States alone, we can't be everywhere. I don't think anybody wants to be everywhere. It's not feasible, right? You just have to look at it from the economics. So then you have to look for the best providers that you can find in those locales to help service. And you want them to be not only somebody that can really understand what's required from a healthcare perspective. We have to get into the training specifically on things like direct to patient and cell and gene therapy, what's at stake, what's expected. And so that is something that is really critical for us to look at and consistently monitor, because it's something that really at the end of the day, they're in some cases, frankly, patient facing. They're individuals that are really on the ground and need to understand exactly what the situation they're walking into entails and looks like, and what type of communication we would expect if there are any issues. We have worked on some internal tools that are really helping us, an app in particular that we're sharing with key local service providers at this point. And that's something that is really simple in terms of the integration. Our team did a terrific job standing this up on one specific cell and gene customer's kind of demand. They were looking for a better way to manage certain specific information that wouldn't be required for everybody, but it seems as everybody has specific requirements. So it's a lot to ask of the individual local service providers when you have, on a pickup, you might have 10 tasks that they have to do and check off each one. So we were initially deploying checklist type methodology, and now this has become more of an app and more of an electronic tool that we're using internally. And that, of course, has legs. We've also done some QR code work where we can kind of, especially if we're using GPS, we can have visibility to what's inside that box before anybody opens it. So if you're delivering it to a hospital, want to check the temperature, anything, that's going on inside the box, you can know. The same if you're going to a person's home, right? You want to make sure you understand if there's been any type of temperature deviation along the way before you open that and then have a big surprise. So these are the types of things that, again, when I think about it from kind of a higher level looking down, these are all ways that we can tie that information and as much as possible share that information with our customers. Some don't want all that information, some want that and more. So I think we have an opportunity and obligation to really help with that digitalization effort.
I love the way you described that, and I was sort of thinking in the back of my mind the word, sort of the phrase supply chain visibility, which people throw around that term so regularly, but really supply chain visibility, it depends on who you're talking to. It can mean so many different things: visibility on the shipment itself, visibility on the, as you noted, the temperature of the payload, maybe the external temperature, maybe the ambient profiling of the trade lane itself, visibility into the nuances of either the pickup or the delivery location, which I imagine for cell and gene therapy is probably far more complex than it is for other types of shipments. I know that, we've talked about it a little bit in the past. Could you share a little bit about, these shipments are getting delivered to campuses or, medical campuses that you're just not dropping this material off on a receiving dock. You're actually getting into these locations, as I understand it, going through the entrance desk, and you're in some cases hand delivering these medications right to the point of dispensing. Is that, I mean, share with us a little bit about sort of the complexities or nuances associated with these types of.
It seems like a simple thing, but when you think about how busy people are in the hospital setting right now, and that's really that's the backdrop of a lot of what we do. We're picking up from the hospitals after these critical patient draws are occurring, and then we're delivering back to the hospitals when that treatment has been manufactured and ready to be administered to that patient. So you're absolutely right. And it is something that from my experience in visiting a lot of hospitals around the country and some of the greatest medical facilities in the world, those are not small in many cases. So there are specific rooms or suites that we need to be able to find and access in many cases, or we have to have a very specific meeting point. So the communication to that individual, whether we're picking up and delivering, is key. We need at least one person, and we need a cell phone number, and we need to make sure that we have a secondary should that person be detained, maybe even in a patient-facing situation. So it is really critical that they know where we are and they can check on us, but also that we can reach them and find them at the time of need. And that does get into the weeds, and that puts a lot of stress on the driver that's on site trying to do the right thing, because even just navigating some of these campuses and even within the buildings can be a bit challenging. So I don't want to take anything away from the hard work that goes into doing that, because it's an absolutely critical piece of the final mile in our world. I think a lot of other final miles look a little bit easier once you hit the right address.
And I imagine even on those campuses, you know, one day you might have a driver delivering to the oncology department, another day you're the same driver is delivering to autoimmune deficiency, and they're not necessarily right next to each other, right? I mean, so having that unique on the ground sort of knowledge is got to be critical to the service itself.
It is, and I think that that's a really good point, because I've been at a couple of events this week and talking to various people, and one of the challenges, of course, everybody has with the hospital institutions is really making sure we have enough people to manage the amount of cell and gene therapies in particular that are coming. There's a lot of work that's being done that I really just have to tip my hat to these folks that are managing both the patients and also the complexities of these draws and administering. Both are really akin to surgical procedures. So you have to give them a lot of credit. But to your point, it's not like typically you're going to have a team that moves from, you know, the CAR T space within oncology over to immuno. That's not going to happen typically. You're going to need people in both disciplines that are going to have that expertise. And we're expanding, thankfully, into more and more therapeutic areas with these cell and gene therapies. And they're really, again, life-changing in many respects. And I think that as that happens, we really need to look at the scalability of both the hospitals as well as the manufacturing centers. Both are critically important. But when I step back and think about where we're in the middle of all this, right, we're connecting the two. And at the same time, we're also dealing with another industry, the airline industry, in many cases, that is also tough. So we have to do everything we can to be out in front of potential issues and just be as communicative as we possibly can. And digitalization more and more is going to help us with that. But it doesn't take away the key need for relationships and for us to have that trust with individuals that know when it's crunch time, we will show up and we'll be there and we'll do everything we can to pull a rabbit out of the hat when we need to.
Yeah, and not to sort of add to it, but you know, I mean, turnover in the industry, whether it's turnover at the healthcare facility or turnover on the driver's side, I imagine that further complicates the scenario. I mean, if you've got low turnover and people end up building longer relationships, then of course it streamlines the process a bit. But
yeah, it's fundamental to, you know, you're working together and really in a way that is unprecedented. And I think, again, that's a silver lining through COVID. We were able to take the level of collaboration, not that it didn't exist at all before, but frankly, there's a lot of people that are very busy trying to make sure that the machine works, the supply chain works. And we saw what can happen throughout COVID when supply chains are broken for a number of reasons, right? I mean, it could be the ability to manufacture, the ability to have goods that are needed. So there's a lot of fundamental pieces to that that are critical, and it needs to operate as well as we can manage it. But at the same time, I think when I kind of talk to the various therapy developers, they're again focused on manufacturing and focused on patient treatment. And now supply chain has entered that conversation as another key pillar. It's one of the key 3 pillars of really the focus. And even some of the investors that are looking at that space will mention supply chain. And sometimes it's not positive, it's a vulnerability. So we have to do everything possible to meet those challenges. And they're very real, but I also have to kind of step back and say, wow, we've been able to manage this, and we can continue to manage it. And there are better tools out there that will help us manage it more in the future. So we're constantly looking forward.
Well, I mean, that whole focus on risk management, risk mitigation, documentation around your standard operating procedures. I mean, those are just, it's so critical in terms of helping to ensure that you're prepared for when things don't go as planned.
Right. And I think that invariably they do go wrong on occasion. So how fast can we react? And that's really what it's become. It's not what are you going to do? It's how quickly are you going to make that first step? And do you have a plan in place already? That's kind of the expectation now that we're dealing with. And I think that that's a very good thing. That's the way that it should be when you think about the criticality of what we're doing. The industry also could use some standardization throughout. And there's been some incredible efforts with people just on the way that they're labeling some of these products and some of these materials within cell and gene therapy in particular. And we need to take that industry kind of workforce and working groups that have made that happen and look at other areas and share information more. We're constantly challenging each other, and even the therapy developers challenge one another. You don't need to share trade secrets to agree on process alignment on some high level and really big ticket items that could make a very big difference, just in kind of looking at it practically in terms of how the supply chain should and could work and some of the nuances within that. You're always going to have some customer variations, and flexibility has to be part of it, and adaptability has to be part of it from our point of view. But I think we need to minimize some of that as much as we can and go with what we know is standard practice and works. And if we need to break the barriers and try something new, that's okay too. But we should not be kind of adhering to different standards from everybody. That's really the challenge we face today.
Right, I couldn't agree more. And I know this is the focus of today's discussion, but it's so blatantly obvious to me that these investments in broader supply chain digitalization are going to drive better visibility and better control around the variability in the broader supply chain. It reminds me of a paper I co-authored with a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Rafiq Bashara, and it was titled Validation versus Qualification and Good Cold Chain Management Practices. And we were just talking about the paper was focused on broader risk management and the variability in the broader supply chain. You can do all the work you want to in a lab, but put it in the real world, and it's a completely different scenario.
Yeah, well, Dr. Bashara, what a tremendous individual, human being, educator, advocate for all that's right in our swim lane, right? You and I have been in this arena for a long time in parallel. And I think of kind of the things that people like Rafiq have brought to the table for all of us are things that we still chew on, things that we still battle through, right? And there's always going to be challenges, but we have to be honest about those challenges and work through them together. I think that we've learned that that's possible, and there are a lot of success stories through that. And again, not everything's going to go perfect, but when it does go sideways, how are we going to react and how are we going to coalesce and make sure we provide every bit of support we can to turn things around. I think that's really ultimately what this is all about. And for my particular arena now with QuickSTAT, we're in the specialty logistics market, and we're already a contingency typically to standard logistics providers when people come to us. And so it is very interesting when I think about kind of the mindset and sometimes the chaos that comes along with it. And you have to be probably a little bit crazy to do it day in and day out for over 30 years like I have, but at the same time, no 2 days are alike.
Well, I know patient safety and product quality is at the heart of what you do as an individual, and of course representative of your organization. And just knowing you for the length of period that I have, I know it's deeply rooted in your individual, as an individual. So could I take us back to visibility? Because I know we've talked about how cell and gene therapy shipments are tracked today. Most of them are tracked with real-time in-transit data logging devices. I know we've talked about the fact that sometimes the decision on that particular type of device is controlled by Quick, sometimes it's not. My understanding is that, you may be forced to log into different systems to pull the data. And we all know that each one of these vendors on the market today have proprietary file format structures. So do you see an opportunity to harmonize the way in which that data flows and provide a sort of a harmonized file of record as it pertains to the digitalization of the movement of those goods?
Absolutely. I think the key to understand too is we're not really looking at particularly temperature data unless there's an issue, right? So it's almost like that data just needs to be stored and maintained for whatever period of time that might be required for that particular situation. And it can vary a little bit by country and perhaps by use. But I think when things do go wrong, it would be awful nice to be able to respond similarly irrespective of the device that's being used. And frankly, that's real-time monitoring. That's what that's there for. But if I had everything that I would love to see, it'd be, aggregate all that data, the good and the bad, so we could start looking at routes. We could start looking at kind of more predictive. But yeah, we're a ways away from doing that, I think, again, because of the proprietary and who owns the data, the proprietary structures that you mentioned of that data, and getting everybody to open that up. It's going to take some pressure from a lot of folks beyond you and I to really make that happen. But ideally, it does make sense that that data is more open and that we do share it. And there has been efforts in pockets where that's been done. And I completely applaud that and think that it can serve for the greater good if we really want to take a look at this industry and say, where can AI come in? Well, that's a great example. If you have 50,000 shipment records of temperature data and you have that all, so the one of the keys is really the details, right? So you don't want to just know that it went from Sao Paulo into, London or whatever the route might be. You want to know what the temperature expectations were, what was the monitor set for, what was the packaging that was used. You really do need all of that information to give you a true picture of what you're measuring. But yeah, it would be wonderful if we could kind of look at that from a broad view and look at it across different ways of shipping, different airlines, different ways to get to and from those points. It would be wonderful.
Michael, your time's hugely valuable, and I want to be respectful of it. But I also want to ask you, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question. Knowing that your QuickSTAT is part of Kuehne+Nagel, and we've referenced the broad global industry reach that an organization the size of Kuehne+Nagel has, and as an industry leader in the space, could you share with us a little bit about QuickSTAT and how does an organization like QuickSTAT that focuses in cell and gene therapy, DTP, DFP, specialty contracted logistics services, how do you, what sort of benefits do you see? What do you leverage? When do you leverage your broader corporate parents network and or services?
It's a really great question, and I think the best way for me to describe it, because QuickSTAT is really a dedicated life sciences organization, and what we really look to Kuehne for is support on anything that starts to get down the life cycle into commercialization and into that growth arena, where does it make sense for us to be shipping 40 pallets domestically in the US once a drug is approved and that drug is growing. So those are typical Kuehne 101. That's what they do. What we kind of look at is the early part of this life cycle before it gets to commercialization. So we did do a ton of work outside of even cell and gene therapy, as well as direct to patient in clinical trials and clinical trial materials and laboratory samples. So we do a lot of work preclinical, so even before it gets into humans, and then early phase clinical trials. And there's a lot of work that goes into preclinical that could be around the development of the compounds. It could start getting a little bit of animal testing. So there's a lot that happens before it even gets into clinical trials. But we do focus mostly in the clinical trials arena. So you've got phase 1 through 3, where it's building up the number of patients and expanding the geographies of those patients. And once we get to that commercialization point in cell and gene therapy, because the supply chain, frankly, remains just as complex as it does in the clinical arena, once it commercializes, QuickSTAT's still involved typically. But when we look at other drugs that are getting approvals at that point, and maybe even there's post-marketing studies that are required, so like a phase 4 study, that is something where there is often a handshake, and we're working with certain customers specifically on when that handoff would occur between QuickSTAT and Kuehne, because we very much operate independently, but we very much collaborate on this exact subject. Where can we best be putting our collective foots forward to make sure that the industry is getting what they need on the healthcare and life sciences arena?
So to paraphrase that, I think what I heard you say is your customers greatly appreciate the opportunity to work with you across both the clinical and the commercial development. You can really help support them through that growth phase as a product moves through each of those stages.
That's right. I mean, and I think we spend a lot of time trying to explain exactly how we see that life cycle, and it's not the same for every journey or for every drug or every organization, but understanding that we have the ability to do and kind of frankly look at other areas too. That Kuehne, for example, does storage. QuickSTAT typically has not done storage, and we're really focused on the transportation. So there are several areas where we could look at working even more together, and already are looking at those areas. And I think it's wonderful. It's been a terrific experience for me meeting people that come from that Kuehne side of the organization that really have a different perspective than I do. And I'm kind of in the weeds of clinical trials, looking through this commercialization path that's typically drawn, in our case, with cell and gene therapy. But it's terrific to understand more of the bigger picture and what happens after we work so hard on maybe an influenza vaccine or something of that nature, get it to the point where it's approved, and then turn it over when it gets to that growth cycle, and they're shipping so and serving so many patients. It's unbelievable to me that that could all be done from one organization, from even before a clinical trial starts.
That's great. Thank you. I think that's a very good place for us to bring this to a close, because that helps sort of frame the broader scope of today's conversation. But Michael, I cannot thank you enough. You've been such a great resource for me personally over the years. You've just been so incredibly gracious and kind, and always willing to extend a hand and offer up your insights and guidance. So thank you for that. And thank you, of course, for participating in today's Orchestrating Outcomes series. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Henry. I always appreciate talking to you and feel mutual benefit in terms of exchanging information and ideas over 2 decades plus. So we'll have to keep that going.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And best of luck. And I know you're going to continue to do a fantastic job there at QuickSTAT, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Henry. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Orchestrating Outcomes in our logistics series. Stay tuned for more episodes as we continue to explore supply chain digitalization initiatives.